Hey guys, today we're going to talk about the two companion cases on federalism, and they are companion cases. That's how the AP class teaches them. That's how you should think about them. They're both dealing with the same topic. They're both, trying to reach decisions about the limits of state power versus national power and balancing the scales of federalism. So keep that idea in mind when we go over these two cases. I have these broken down into a nice shorthand to help you remember the facts about those cases a little bit easier. There's a lot of information on Supreme Court cases. That's one of the reasons why I gave you guys those street law packets on Supreme Court cases on the website rather than have you read the actual text of those court cases, because the Supreme Court opinions can be a bit of a slog to read through in their bare essentials. So let's talk about first McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch versus Maryland is a very early Supreme Court case. It's, I believe, 1803 when the court case occurs, so it's very early in kind of testing the new limits of the Constitution. So I have this handy little acronym that uses SCOTUS, which stands for Supreme Court of the United States, but it also stands for the setting, context, opinion, text, United States Constitution clauses, and significance. So I know that's a bit of a mouthful in terms of items, but I feel like it's a really easy way to keep those court cases nice and concise in your mind. So for McCulloch versus Maryland, what happened is the state of Maryland opposed the creation of a national bank. There was this big fight in U.S. politics at the time over whether or not Congress should create a national bank and whether that gave the national government too much power over the economy to have a national bank. So this was a fight that was going on in every state. This was a fight that was going on in Congress, in the Senate. Presidents who were either supportive or opposed the idea of a national bank, going back and forth with each other. So Congress establishes the national bank. Maryland decides to institute a tax on that national bank in order to try to exercise influence over it and control over it, because they didn't like the idea of a federal institution within the borders of their state that they had no control over. So James McCulloch, the cashier of the bank, was instructed by Thomas Jefferson not to pay the tax, because even though Jefferson believed in the rights of the states, he also didn't believe that the states should have total authority over the national government. He was trying to strike that balance as well. So he loses an appeal in the Maryland court, and then it goes over to the federal courts and eventually to the United States Supreme Court. Maryland's argument was basically, you can't find the word bank in the Constitution. If you look in the Constitution, create a bank is not one of the enumerated powers. That's not listed by the Constitution as something that Congress has the power to do. So they're trying to do a very narrow reading of the Constitution. Basically, if the words aren't in there, you don't have those powers. Congress, though, is saying, look, the Constitution says we have to print and coin money, and we have to establish a treasury. And you need a vehicle to get that money that Congress has the constitutional authority to print and distribute. You need a distribution method. And a national bank is a way to get that currency into the economy, because then other banks and states can go to the national bank to withdraw currency or exchange currency or take out loans. And so it makes the national bank the way that you can distribute money out into the economy. It's a much more nuanced system instead of showing up with big bags of money every time you have to replace currency, but it is very straightforward. It allows Congress to meet its constitutional obligation. And so that's what the Supreme Court found. It's a unanimous decision, so you didn't have to write about a dissent because there was no dissent. The court held that Congress did have the power to incorporate a bank, and that Maryland could not tax that bank because it was a national government extension through the Constitution. And this is a really important case because it explains how the necessary and proper clause is going to work in practice. There are certain explicit powers that are enumerated by the Constitution that the federal government has, like raising an army, printing and coining money, creating a navy, commissioning officers, establishing a post office, maintaining postal roads. There are very specific things in the Constitution that are powers of the national government. The necessary and proper clause allows Congress to meet those responsibilities by creating additional laws that help them do that. So it really expands what Congress can and cannot do. The necessary and proper clause gives a lot more flexibility to Congress in the use of its powers. So print and coin money, that's the enumerated power. It's implied then that they could create a bank to help distribute that money. So the necessary and proper clause, the main significance is that ability to create those implied powers where it's not explicitly in the Constitution, but it's implied that it would be needed. The supremacy clause is also upheld in this case because you have a conflict. The states say Congress can't create a national bank. It's not in the Constitution. Well, the courts have now said they can create that national bank. And if they can create that national bank, then states are prohibited from interfering with Congress carrying out its duties according to the Constitution. So they win that argument. That's the supremacy clause. It doesn't mean that the national government always wins. There are times the national government loses in court. But it does mean that when there's a clear link to a constitutional power, when it makes sense for Congress to be doing something in order to govern as a national government, they're going to win that argument. All right, the next clause is U.S. versus Lopez. Case. U.S. versus Lopez is much more contemporary. This is a case, from not necessarily your lifetime, but your parents' lifetime in the 1990s. So this is a case that is contemporary with episodes of Friends. Maybe at least the early ones. So, it's a little bit more complicated. This case has to do with a couple different things. So, Alfonso Lopez is a high school student. He carries a concealed weapon into a San Antonio high school. That's bad. He shouldn't have done that. That's a huge mistake as a student. Don't do things like that. He's charged under a Texas law with firearm possession on school premises. But they dismiss the state charges because there's a higher order set of charges that the federal government can bring because of the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990. And that was a federal law that prohibited carrying firearms within a school zone. And so since that is the more severe charge because it's a federal law, it took precedence and they dismissed the state court charge of possession of a firearm. So Congress is doing this, ostensibly for a good reason, keeping guns out of school zones, keeping people with weapons away from schools. But many states, including Texas, which I don't know if you've met a Texan, Texas is very independent-minded. They still joke that they're their own country and they could leave anytime they want to. They tried. There was a whole war. It didn't go well. Sidebar. They're an independent-minded state, and they didn't like the idea of their laws being cast aside to enforce these federal laws. So the Lopez representatives brought an appeal to his conviction that argued not necessarily that he didn't break the law. They're just saying, yeah, he had a gun. He shouldn't have had the gun there. He broke the law. Their argument was the law is inappropriate, and the law is not reflective of the system of federalism that the framers of the Constitution intended. So this is a closer case. It's a 5-4 decision. The majority rules that possessing guns in a school zone is not an economic activity. And when Congress wrote the Gun-Free School Zone Act, they cited the Commerce Clause as the constitutional root of their authority to make this law through the Necessary and Proper Clause. And the courts basically said, that's too broad a definition. There's no economic activity that constitutes commerce in this situation, so Congress didn't have the baseline constitutional authority to pass that law. The 3 dissenting judges said that there is some kind of economic value in safeguarding education, so that the commerce action here wasn't about guns. The commerce action was about, having a well-educated population. People with a high school degree beyond are much less burdensome on the state than people who never get a high school degree. They use more public services, they're more likely to commit crimes, they're more likely to be a burden on the state, whereas people who go beyond high school, once you have a high school diploma, you start to decrease your reliance on the state, and the further up the educational chain you go, the more likely you are to be paying taxes as a net than using taxes. So the 2 key clauses here, first the Commerce Clause. that Congress can regulate interstate trade and international trade. And secondly, again, the necessary and proper clause. But the significance here is this does the opposite of McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch versus Maryland expands federal power through the necessary and proper clause. It gives Congress more authority to make laws. U.S. versus Lopez is the upper limits of that. So they're saying there is a ceiling here. You can't use the necessary and proper clause and commerce clause as your default to make any law you want. There is a limitation on it. It does need to fit within the scope of what the Constitution had intended that power to be. And this is the result of a big debate that we see in law on the Supreme Court about how much can you bend the Constitution? How much flexibility is there in the Constitution? It's a living Constitution. It adapts to modern times. That's why it's one of the longest standing governing documents in the modern world. But there are limits to it. It does not permit everything. So just again, to take a look here at the Commerce Clause, the whole point of the Commerce Clause is it gives Congress the power to regulate trade with foreign nations, among the several states, and with Indian tribes. And along with the necessary and proper clause, this is really the bulk of Congress's authority to regulate everything from how products are made, cars needing to have backup cameras, seat belts, airbags, health rulings in terms of how clean water has to be, what goes into certain products that aren't permitted within the United States. The entire war on drugs is actually predicated on the necessary and proper clause and the Commerce Clause. That's why you would think, oh, well, you see all these states legalizing marijuana. Well, technically, Congress still has the authority through the necessary and proper clause and Commerce Clause to regulate drugs and ban those drugs outright. It's just interesting historical intersection of modern federalism and the war on drugs being a major cost for states that has led to a lot of these legalization movements. Just to give you kind of an idea of how much counts as commerce, literally everything. Things that are commerce according to the Constitution, anything you buy, firearms, water, air, land, houses, pets, cars, food, drugs, both legal and illegal, clothing, plants, roads, trains, planes, flying, bikes, having a job, not having a job, profanity, obscenity, radio waves, the internet, everything that you can buy on Etsy, marijuana, alcohol, tobacco, advertising, farm animals, professional wrestling, football helmets, health insurance, daylight savings time, SpaceX, private gardens, basically anything you can think of does fall under the scope of commerce, which is why it's one of the most important clauses in the Constitution. So I hope that helps clear up the differences between those two cases. Basically anything that involves transaction can be governed by Congress in that way. So keep that in mind next time you go and buy something at a gas station.